What would you do if you had nothing left? Not food, not safety, not even water. And suddenly a dying warrior collapsed at your doorstep, not just any man, but one your neighbors feared, one your father warned you about. A man marked by war paint and legends that kept settlers up at night. Would you help him? Mercy Whitmore didn't hesitate. The well had gone dry 3 days ago. She was 16 alone and down to the last murky bucket of water that stood between her and death. But when she found him broken, bleeding, barely breathing, she did something most people wouldn't. She knelt down and gave him the only thing keeping her alive, her last water. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask if he was friend or foe. She just gave. And that one act, simple, silent, almost foolish, set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. By nightfall, 700 painted warriors would surround her home. 12 U.S. soldiers would point rifles at her head. And Mercy would have to choose loyalty to the world she knew or trust in the people she was taught to fear. Because when you offer kindness to a dying man sometimes, the whole world comes knocking. And what Mercy found that day, it didn't just change her life, it changed everything. The land was dry, the kind of dry that cracked the earth open like broken porcelain. Every step Mercy Whitmore took sent small clouds of dust swirling around her bare ankles as if the ground itself had grown weary of being stepped on. It hadn't rained in weeks. Her well had given up days ago. The little water she had left warm, cloudy, barely enough to wet her lips, sat sloshing in a wooden bucket hugged tightly to her chest like something sacred. She was 16, alone, and had been for 8 long months. Somewhere before the world went quiet, she used to dream of dresses and dances. Her mother once braided her hair with wildflowers. Her father taught her how to set rabbit traps and read the wind. Now, they were both gone, buried deep in soil, too stubborn to remember their names. All she had left was the rhythm of survival: wake, walk, search, wait, sleep. Repeat. Hope wasn't something she reached for anymore. It was something she tried not to look at too closely. And then she saw him, face down in the dirt at the edge of her land. His chest barely rose. A smear of red across his side soaked the ground beneath him. One arm bent the wrong way. A bone-handled knife lay near his fingers, and paint dark, fierce lines across his skin told her what he was before she saw the scar: Lakota. The K, her breath caught in her throat. Her feet froze. Everything inside her said to walk away. She had nothing to give, nothing to gain, nothing but that last bucket of water and the quiet comfort of not getting involved. But then she saw his lips, cracked, dry, as if the earth had stolen all the moisture from him too. And she moved. She didn't speak, didn't think, just knelt, lifted his head, and tilted the bucket. Drop by drop, she gave him the only thing keeping her alive. His throat moved as he swallowed. His eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy and burning with fever, but focused. And in that moment, she wasn't a settler girl and he wasn't a painted warrior. They were just 2 human beings, caught in the same cruel desert. She tore her dress to bind his wounds, used the last of her clean cloth, let her hands shake, let her fear scream in the back of her mind. But she didn't stop, because sometimes kindness isn't about what you have. It's about what you choose. And in choosing to help him in that dry wind, under that cruel sun, Mercy unknowingly pulled a thread that connected 2 worlds on the edge of war. By nightfall, hoofbeats would thunder across her land. War paint and uniforms would blur into the horizon. And one act of compassion would demand a courage she didn't yet know she had. But before the riders came, before the rifles were raised, Mercy would have to face something even harder than danger, the weight of what she'd done. The sun hadn't yet finished rising when the sound reached her. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, then hundreds. Mercy stood frozen outside her cabin, the wooden bucket now empty at her feet. Behind her, the warrior she'd saved, Akacheta, she'd heard him whisper, still lay unconscious, bandaged with strips of her own dress. And now the horizon was filling with shadows on horseback, a sea of war paint and feathers. It should have felt like doom, but somehow it didn't. She remembered her father's voice, low and cautious. Never forget Mercy. One wrong gesture can spark a fire no river can put out. And yet here she was, a girl barely old enough to be called a woman with blood on her hands and no river in sight. The warriors fanned out with silent precision, surrounding her land like a tide. They did not shout. They did not charge. They simply watched with eyes sharp enough to cut through fear. The one who dismounted first had gray in his braids and a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, just like Akacheta. He was older, but something about the way he walked made the earth seem smaller beneath his feet. And in his silence, Mercy saw it not wrath, but grief. He looked at the wounded man on the ground, his son, and then at her. Her torn dress, the clean bandages, the empty bucket. And in that moment, across all their differences, he saw what she'd done. But before words could be exchanged, the thunder came again from the east. The cavalry, 12 soldiers, blue coats, raised rifles, and the unmistakable voice of a young lieutenant who'd never seen real war, but thought he understood it. "Stand down," he barked. "Release the girl and withdraw from this territory." Mercy didn't move. She couldn't, because something inside her had already shifted something deeper than fear or instinct. Something that told her, if you run now, you'll never be able to live with who you were. So she stepped forward, not away from danger, but toward it, toward the line where peace and bloodshed met like flint and steel. And when the chief Tatanka demanded an explanations in a language her ears didn't know, but her heart understood, she answered the only way she could. She placed herself between the two sides, between drawn guns and sharpened tomahawks. "I helped him," she said, voice steady despite the tremble in her bones, "because he needed help, that's all. Not a declaration of politics, not an act of betrayal, just humanity offered in its rawest form." And for a moment the world paused, not because peace had arrived, but because it might. That fragile stillness, that breath held between history and hope, would not last long. But for Mercy Whitmore, a girl who had been alone for far too long, it was enough to believe that one act of goodness still had power in a world hardened by violence. And that belief would soon be tested, not just by warriors or soldiers, but by her own decision to cross a line no settler had ever crossed before. The first time Mercy looked into the eyes of 700 warriors, she forgot how to breathe. They didn't shout. They didn't raise weapons. They didn't need to. Their stillness spoke louder than war cries ever could. Paint streaked their faces in colors she didn't recognize. Deep reds, black lines, symbols of identity, mourning, pride, and resistance. Feathers moved gently in the breeze like prayers whispered into the wind. And in every stare that met hers, Mercy felt a question pulsing just beneath the surface. "What are you doing here, settler girl?" She didn't have an answer. Not one they would trust. Not yet. Her heart thundered as Chief Tatanka approached. He was older than she'd realized up close, not just by years, but by stories. His face was weathered with the weight of generations, and in his eyes was a kind of tired wisdom that didn't forgive easily. Beside him lay his son, Akacheta, still unconscious, but breathing easier now, thanks to her. Tatanka looked at the blood-stained cloth at the last drops of water she'd poured into his son's mouth. Then he looked at her, and something in his gaze shifted, not softened, but deepened, as if trying to understand a language of choices without words. And then, once again, the calm cracked. The cavalry arrived. Blue coats, blunt orders, and behind them, centuries of mistrust wrapped in polished buttons and steel sabers. Mercy stood between two worlds that had never spoken in peace. Two worlds raised on fear of the other. One taught to see savagery, the other taught to see theft. And for a moment, she felt the full weight of those misunderstandings bearing down on her shoulders. A girl with no tribe, no rank, no authority, only watered kindness and torn cloth between the past and the future. But then Akacheta stirred. His voice was weak, but certain when he spoke. "She gave me life," he said, "when she could have let me die." And that changed everything. Because among the Lakota, such a statement carried the weight of law. To protect someone who saved your life was not just honor, it was duty. Akacheta stood wounded, but proud, and declared Mercy under his protection. Tatanka's expression didn't change, but Mercy noticed the silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was listening. The soldiers didn't understand. The lieutenant scoffed. But the Lakota did. They knew what it meant to bind yourself to someone with your word. They knew that when life was given, it must be guarded. And so, when Tatanka offered her a horse and a choice to come with them willingly or return to her kind, Mercy looked back at her empty cabin and stepped forward, because sometimes the path of peace isn't found by staying where it's safe. It's carved one careful step into unfamiliar land, and so began her journey into a world no settler had ever lived to describe. Tatanka's silence was louder than any accusation. Around the fire in the heart of the great lodge, Mercy sat cross-legged, her fingers curled nervously into the hem of her patched dress. The soft crackle of burning wood was the only sound between them. Akacheta, still weak but alert, rested nearby, watching, listening, but saying nothing. This was not his moment. This was his father's. Tatanka Yotake, chief of his people, sat with the weight of war on one shoulder and the raw wound of love on the other. His son had been returned to him alive because of the girl sitting before him, a settler girl. The same kind of settler who had taken rivers, forests, and brothers. The same kind of stranger who rode with rifles and built fences around sacred ground. But she had not come with guns. She had come with water. And now Tatanka had to choose honor, what she had done, or avenge what her people had taken. His eyes, dark, thoughtful, lingered on Mercy's face for a long time. He was searching for something. Truth, perhaps, or the absence of it. But Mercy didn't flinch. She didn't try to plead or justify. Her hands were empty, her words few. "I didn't save your son to earn anything," she finally said, voice low but steady. "I just couldn't leave him there." Not like that. Tatanka's jaw tightened as if those words struck somewhere old and wounded inside him. He looked toward Akacheta, who nodded once solemnly without speaking. Then he turned back to Mercy. "My people have a word," Tatanka said, voice like river stone, "for the one who gives without expecting. For the one who sees the soul before the face. We call them Waniyetu Wiyaka, the winter giver." Mercy blinked. "Why?" "Winter, because winter is when we have the least, and to give, when you have nothing, that is when it matters most." The firelight flickered between them. Something shifted. Tatanka did not smile. Chiefs rarely did. But his next words held a gravity Mercy hadn't felt since her father died. "My son says you are under his protection," he said. "That makes you under mine." Relief didn't flood her. Not yet. Because even in that acceptance, she felt the tension humming beneath. This wasn't over. It wasn't peace. Not truly. It was only a moment of grace held aloft by fragile trust and the trembling breath of two people who chose not to hate. Tatanka stood and turned toward the shadows beyond the firelight, where others listened, elders, warriors, children with wide eyes and quiet breath. "This girl," he said, "came not as enemy. She brought life to my son. That debt is sacred." And with that, Mercy was no longer just a stranger. She had become a question for an entire nation to answer. But the outside world? It wasn't waiting. Scouts would arrive before dawn with news that would shatter this calm. And Mercy's act of kindness, meant to save one life, was now threatening to ignite many. The offer was simple. But the choice was anything but. Tatanka's words had barely settled in the air when Winona, the tribe's storyteller, approached Mercy by the fire. Her silver hair glinted like moonlight, her voice as calm and steady as a river at dusk. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises," she said, "you will choose." Mercy stared at her, uncertain. "Choose what? To stay, or to return to the world you knew?" The words echoed inside her like church bells from a ghost town. Stay, and step fully into a life that was foreign, feared, and deeply misunderstood. Or go back to the world of fences and whispers of soldiers and suspicion, where her story would be twisted if it was believed at all. That night, sleep did not come easily. The lodge around her breathed with the quiet rhythm of fire and earth. Outside, the camp hummed women singing softly to children. Warriors murmuring around distant fires, horses shifting in the dark like restless ghosts. Mercy lay still, staring at the painted roof above her, her thoughts louder than the wind. What was she choosing really? She thought of her father's cabin, how he'd carved each beam with his hands. She thought of the creek trail, of the worn snare lines, of the emptiness she'd come to call survival. That place had raised her. But it no longer held her. Not the way these people had. Because here in the land she'd been taught to fear, someone had listened. Someone had believed her. Akachita had offered his protection without asking anything in return. Tatanka had withheld vengeance for the sake of honor. And Winona, with her eyes full of ancient storms, had offered mercy. To mercy. By morning her heart knew the answer. So when the sun crowned the hills in soft gold, and the tribe gathered in a wide circle beneath the rising light, Mercy stepped forward without hesitation. "I choose to stay," she said. A hush rippled across the camp. Tatanka's expression didn't change, but his nod was one of deep recognition, not approval, not pride, something older respect. Winona stepped beside her and wrapped a woven shawl over Mercy's shoulders. "Then learn. Listen. Walk with us, not ahead of us." It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't a celebration. But it was a beginning. Later that day, she helped grind corn beside women who spoke little English but offered warm smiles. Children tugged at her sleeves, asking questions with their eyes. Even the horses seemed less wary. She was still other, but no longer outsider. Yet peace, like winter sun, can be deceiving in its warmth. Because just as Mercy began to settle into this new rhythm of belonging, distant hooves thundered on the horizon. A scout galloped into the camp, breathless. His words struck like a storm breaking the sky. "The soldiers are coming. Hundreds, armed, angry." Mercy's stomach dropped. Her choice, noble as it had been, had lit a match in a powder room of politics and pride. And now what she had tried to save might fall into ruin. Mercy had never seen so many eyes watching her, not with hostility, but with something far more difficult to carry: curiosity. It wasn't a stare that demanded she leave. It wasn't suspicion, veiled as politeness. It was something else, silent questions echoing from every corner of the camp. Who is she? Why is she here? Can she be trusted? Her first days among the Lakota passed slowly, like learning to breathe in a different rhythm. There were no clocks, no bells. Time moved with the sun and the fire, with hunger and song. Her body, so used to survival, had to learn how to exist again, this time, not alone, but surrounded. Each morning she helped carry water side by side with women who didn't speak her tongue, yet smiled when she stumbled, but tried again. She ground corn with children pressed against her skirt, giggling when she spilled it. She listened to Winona's stories, narratives painted in gesture and tone, not just words, and began to feel their power. The Lakota didn't ask her to become one of them. They only asked that she see them not as the rumors whispered, but as they truly were. People with rhythms, traditions, scars, and a language of spirit deeper than anything she'd ever known. Mercy began to understand that the stories told back in settler towns about savagery, about danger, weren't just lies. They were shields passed from father to son to protect against what couldn't be controlled or understood. Here the faces she'd once feared became familiar. She saw a boy lose his first tooth and run around the camp like a warrior returning from battle. She watched a mother plait her daughter's hair with careful reverence, weaving feathers into every strand as if preparing her for the wind. She heard laughter, so much laughter that it startled her at first. How could a people so often hunted still know joy? But even in the warmth of welcome, Mercy never forgot she was still a settler. And though Akacheta had stood for her and Winona had guided her, not every glance was soft. Some saw only her skin. Some remembered lost land. Some, like the younger warriors, wondered if she was just another ghost in the long line of broken promises. It was fair. Mercy didn't ask for forgiveness. She only offered consistency. She showed up. She listened. She worked. And slowly, not with applause, but with nods and quiet invitations, she found herself inside the circle. One night around the central fire, Tatanka finally addressed her in front of the others. His voice was low, like distant thunder. "You have seen more than most of your people ever will," he said. "You have walked our land, eaten our food, heard our children laugh. But now you must ask yourself, what do you carry back? What truth will you speak?" Mercy looked into the flames, unsure, because she hadn't thought about leaving. Not yet. But she would soon have to. Because while the camp had embraced her, the outside world had not been still. Dust clouds were rising in the east. And this time they brought cannons. The sun had barely risen when the riders came. They didn't carry the scent of peace. They came dressed in pressed blue, armed with rifles, sabers, and the weight of orders barked by men far removed from consequence. Dust curled in their wake. Behind them trailed cannons, groaning iron mouths meant not for justice, but for warnings written in blood. Mercy had hoped in some naive corner of her heart that the world had paused while she learned. That while she sat among fires and stories, while Akacheta healed beside her and children wove beads into her hair, the soldiers would wait. But they hadn't. The young lieutenant, the same boy who had shouted threats on her porch, had returned to Fort Collins, humiliated. And in shame he had done what fearful men often do, rewritten the story. She was captured, he claimed. "They're holding her hostage," he insisted. "It's an act of war." No one questioned him. No one stopped to ask whether a settler girl might choose to stay among those they had labeled enemy. Because when the truth feels too uncomfortable, pride steps in to offer a sharper, cleaner version. Mercy listened to Tatanka deliver the news with sorrow lining every syllable. His voice trembled not from fear, but from the crushing weight of what he already knew. Once war drums echo, they rarely go silent. And worse, the lie had become a banner. Young warriors, restless from seasons of retreat, of watching lands swallowed up inch by inch, now saw Mercy's presence not as a symbol of peace, but proof that it could never be enough. "They will never see us as human," one of them said bitterly. "So let them see us as fire." Even as Mercy begged to return to the soldiers and speak the truth herself, she could see the doubt clouding the faces around her. Not because they didn't believe her courage, but because they feared no one else would. "War doesn't begin with bullets," Winona whispered beside her that night. "It begins with forgetting the face of your neighbor, forgetting the story you don't want to hear." Mercy understood now. War wasn't just about land or power. It was about stories. And right now, the story marching toward them on horseback behind banners and cannon wheels wasn't hers. It was the lieutenant's. A story where she was the victim, where they were the monsters, where violence was the only righteous ending. But there was still a chance. Faint as it was, a sliver of space where truth might breathe, if only for a moment. Mercy turned to Akacheta. "We ride out tomorrow," she said, "to the middle, before they meet." His gaze was steady, proud. "And if they don't listen, then we ride anyway. Because somewhere beneath fear and armor, someone might still be human enough to hear what kindness sounds like." The valley was quiet, but not calm. From the east, the cavalry stood in rigid formation, 500 strong, their sabers glinting under the gray morning sky. From the west, the Lakota warriors gathered, their faces painted in solemn tones, their horses shifting like shadows in the tall grass. Two worlds poised on the edge of something irreversible, and between them, Mercy rode with a white cloth tied to a branch, fluttering like a desperate prayer. Akacheta rode beside her, pale from his healing wounds, but upright, proud. 5 Lakota warriors flanked them in silence, their expressions unreadable. Every hoofbeat sounded like a heartbeat too loud, echoing the weight of what they were about to do. They weren't soldiers, they weren't leaders. They were just two people, carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. When they reached the midpoint, Mercy dismounted slowly, the white cloth still clutched in her hand. Her dress whipped around her legs in the breeze, her boots caked in dust, her heart pounding so hard she wondered if the soldiers could hear it from where they stood. "I am Mercy Whitmore," she called out, her voice steady despite everything. "I was never taken. I came willingly. I chose to help. I choose to speak now so no one else has to die for a lie." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then from the cavalry's front line, a familiar figure emerged. The young lieutenant eyes, hard pride still raw. "You were coerced," he shouted. "Threatened? You don't know what you're saying." But then Akacheta stepped forward, his voice calm and clear. "She gave me water when she had none, food when she was starving, shelter when she feared for her life. If that is what you call coercion, then may we all be so lucky." His words cut through the morning fog like sunlight. Even the colonel, older, grayer, slower to judgment, sat straighter in his saddle, eyes narrowing in consideration. Mercy looked into that sea of uniforms, at men who might not want to shoot, but who would if told. And she offered them something stronger than anger. She offered truth. And for once, it was enough. The colonel dismounted. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "A peace treaty, born from a bucket of water and a stubborn girl who wouldn't mind her own business." Laughter cracked through the tension, not much, but enough to let air back into the valley. The armies didn't lower their weapons immediately, but they didn't raise them either. And in that fragile stillness, something ancient and sacred stirred a chance. 3 months later, a new kind of gathering rose from that bloodless field. 3 months later, the place where two armies had almost clashed was no longer a battlefield. It was a gathering place. Rough timber was raised. Smoke curled from new chimneys. And at the heart of it all stood a modest cabin, built by hands that once might have held rifles, now laying stone, weaving rope, cooking side by side. Lakota settlers, soldiers, all under one roof. Not because they were the same, but because they had finally dared to see each other as human. Mercy stood at the door of that cabin, watching Akacheta laugh with his father as they struggled to lift a heavy beam into place. Tatanka, the man who had once looked at her with suspicion, sharp as steel, now handed her tools with rough gentleness. His eyes had changed. So had hers. The trading post had become neutral ground, an impossible dream turned tangible. Here children ran barefoot, switching between Lakota and English in the same breath. Blankets traded for flour, beaded jewelry for iron nails, conversations not commands. No document had been signed with ink or seal. The treaty wasn't written on paper. It had been written the moment Mercy poured her last water into the mouth of a dying man. That act echoed through the valley louder than cannon fire ever could, because it wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. Choice to give when you have nothing, to trust when you've only been taught to fear, to stand between two enemies and say, "Not this time." Akacheta healed not only in body, but in spirit. Once a warrior of peace, misunderstood by his own people, he now became a bridge, his voice carrying the weight of two worlds, learning to speak with each other instead of over each other. The young lieutenant had been reassigned to a distant desk job, his bitterness making room for silence. The colonel, however, was honored for avoiding bloodshed, though he would later tell Mercy, "It was never my treaty. It was yours." And it was soaked in courage. Evenings at the trading post became something of a ritual. Fires lit, food shared, stories told. And every so often, someone new would arrive. Another settler lost in fear, another warrior hardened by grief, and they would ask, "How did this all begin?" And Mercy would smile, not with pride but with humility. "It started with a choice," she would say. "A girl with nothing, giving water to a stranger." And that would be enough. Enough to remind them that peace is not something granted from above. It is built slowly, painfully, by those willing to carry the weight of understanding, even when their arms are shaking. But as the sun set over the land that now felt like home, Mercy knew this wasn't the end of her journey. No, something deeper had just begun. Years passed. Seasons came and went like whispers on the wind. And the story of a girl named Mercy Whitmore, who gave her last water to a stranger, slowly became more than just a memory. It became a lesson, a quiet echo that drifted from lodge to cabin, from firelight to frontier. The trading post stood firm through harsh winters and long summers. Children born under its roof grew up hearing both Lakota lullabies and English prayers. Some carried the blood of both peoples. All carried the legacy of peace. Mercy never saw herself as a hero. She didn't carry a rifle or wear a badge or lead an army. She simply made a choice, one small act in one impossible moment. But in the stillness of that act, When she knelt down and gave water to a man who was supposed to be her enemy, she cracked something open in the world. That's how history changes, not always with wars or revolutions, but with kindness so rare it confuses the rules, with courage so gentle it dares to ask, what if we didn't fight this time? And though the names on maps change, though leaders rise and fall, the moment Mercy poured that water will outlast them all. Because it reminds us of something timeless, that peace begins not on paper, but in the hearts of those willing to reach across fear. That compassion, when given without condition, can reroute the very course of nations. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to simply see someone's humanity when the world tells you not to. So when you think your choices don't matter, when the world feels too broken, too divided, remember Mercy. Remember that she was just a girl with bare feet, a dry well, and a heart full of grit. And yet her kindness carved out a space for peace. That's her legacy. And maybe it can be yours too. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video so more people can hear it. Subscribe for more true and powerful stories that prove kindness still matters. And when you're ready, click on the next video on your screen, because the story waiting for you there will take you even deeper into the heart of what it means to stand alone and still choose to do the right thing. Sometimes that's how the world begins to heal. One act at a time, one story at a time. And maybe one viewer like you.